The perspectives expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guests. The views expressed are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the National Institute of Health or the United States government.
Hey, Sickle family. I'm Wunmi Bakare.
And I'm Dima Hendricks. And we would like to welcome you to the Through the Genes podcast,
where we talk about living, healing, recovering, and exploring curative therapies for sickle cell disease.
We will also talk about our individual curative therapy journeys and the bond that we built as sickle cell sisters.
Hey, Sickle family. Welcome to a special episode of Through the Genes. I am your gracious host, Wunmi Bakare, and I have...
Hello, everyone. I'm Dima Hendricks.
Now, today we're going to tackle a very important topic, visible and invisible disabilities and how they impact us. Now, I'd like to welcome these two brand new guests. We are incredibly honored to have been a guest on their podcast, Mind the Gap, which explores themes of identity, self-discovery, personal growth, and we absolutely enjoyed being their guests. So today we have on Seonni and Vanesha. Welcome to the show. Super excited to have you both.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Now, for our Through the Genes audience, we want you to explain Mind the Gap. What made you come up with this concept of this podcast?
Absolutely. So I think the best place to start is 2020. So everyone was going through a lot of things during lockdown. And I was going through my own self-discovery journey, as was Seonni. And I was also deep in my own sort of like podcast listening. And I really enjoy naturally just like talking to people and learning their life stories and how they overcame things. And, you know, I feel like we can learn a lot from other people through the lessons they are learning. And that is around the time that Seonni began her therapy journey, I believe. And so I started telling her about these ideas, and then Seonni, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, we naturally just share a lot between each other, and we thought, wouldn't it be great if we just opened up these conversations for the world, because we learn so much from each other. So there's always something to learn from everyone's conversations. And then we thought, what if we factor in specialists as well who can help us navigate all the things that we're also talking about? So that's kind of where the idea of the podcast began. And then in terms of the name, Mind the Gap is a bit of a homage to the UK, as we're both born and raised here. But also Vanesha and I have a 12-year age gap between us as maternal cousin sisters. We also have a gap with me living in the UK and her being in the US, so there's a cultural gap, but also there's a gap between us and the motherland, so we are both of Indian descent. And then the biggest one is knowledge gap. So over at Mind the Gap, we try and bridge as many of those knowledge gaps with our audience as possible.
Can I just say I love the way you explain that? I was like, oh my God, there's so much to a name. It's not just an age gap, it's the fact that both of you live on basically across the pond from each other. And then also to tack on that, it's kind of bridging the gap between your identity living in the UK versus your identity of being of Indian descent. So I'm super excited to have you both today, because I think when you said something that made me just bring a smile to my face. You said, oh, we are cousin sisters. And for me, that's such a beautiful term, because it really, really highlights the bond that we just share with family. And I always say Dima is my sickle sister. We're not related by blood, but we're related by blood.
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to ask a question that I remember when we had conversations back and forth. I didn't really know what it meant. So can you explain, what is a third culture kid?
Sure. So I can probably explain that best between Seonni and myself. So a third culture kid is somebody who is being raised in a culture that is also different than the culture that their parents grew up in. And so for me, that really strikes home because my dad was born and raised in Zambia in Africa, and my mom was born and raised in the UK. And So had we stayed in the UK, I would have been the daughter of one immigrant parent. But then we immigrated to the US. So my parents then became, my dad, like a second time immigrant, my mom then became an immigrant. And then I am then spending the rest of my growing up years in a culture that is completely unfamiliar to my parents, and especially from my father's side, is also a culture that he is then even more removed from. So there's a, its own culture sort of comes from that, where kind of everywhere is home, but nowhere is home. And that's how you get a third culture kid.
Okay, that just sounds really cool and dope. And as you were speaking, I was like, wait, am I a third culture kid? Because technically I live in the US, but I didn't grow up here. But thank you for that detailed explanation.
Yeah.
Renisha, you actually had a diagnosis when you were younger. Could you
Yes.
explain to us about that before?
Yes. So I will actually talk about multiple health diagnoses. So when I was born, my part of my right eyelid was missing. So I actually had plastic surgery when I was 1.5, almost 2 years old. At the time, like in the 80s, that was a very newly tested surgery. So I wasn't part of the test pool, but I was one of the first people to like actually get that sort of reconstructive surgery. And so I guess before that point, when I would sleep, you'd kind of see part of my eye because there was a gap in my eyelid. So that was the first like health diagnosis. And then as I got older, I used to get a lot of chest pains. I used to find running really hard. I remember going to physical therapy as a kid, but nobody really explained what the connection to that was. They really just told me that, like, because you have a little trouble running, we want to strengthen your lungs. No one really told me anything more than that. And then when I hit puberty, things became very apparent. So that's when I got my actual diagnosis of pectus excavatum.
Mm.
And what that means is an inverted rib cage. For a lot of people, it's both rib cages. For me, it's only one rib cage, so it's on my left side. So I have one side of my chest looks very normal, and the other side is an inverted, so it's concave. And yeah, so that was a great diagnosis to get around puberty. Once, everyone's thinking about like, am I going to get big boobs? Am I going to get cleavage? And I'm like, I don't even have a normal chest to start with. Like, how is this going to go? But yeah, that was kind of my diagnosis, a big shock to the system at a pivotal point of growing up.
So the reason why I asked this question was because our diagnosis, as we mentioned in our podcast through the genes, our diagnosis with a visible disease, sickle cell, defined us and
Mhm.
defined our personalities and who we are. So I wanted to know, how did your diagnosis affect your sense of identity as you grew older?
Absolutely. So I'd say, first of all, like I think most people can say their school age years probably weren't the best. It was really difficult. We're all trying to fit in. For me, it was kind of difficult because it's not something as prevalent as a limb deformity, right? Where someone can actually see it. It's something that's like under my shirt, so I can kind of hide it, but I also kind of can't hide it because it's a depression of the chest. So what I used to do is I used to like stuff my bras right on my left side so that shirts would like fall evenly and that sort of stuff. And it then sort of stemmed like this part of where it was also really skinny, and like weight is a big cultural conversation. So I used to get a lot of compliments for being skinny, and I could never really accept those compliments very well because I was like, but you don't know what I really look like. Like, I know what I look like and I know what my problems are, but you're just seeing a skinny girl. So that began to affect my confidence. I was really depressed in high school. I definitely had thoughts of like, who's ever going to love me? It was like I put myself sort of through the mental health ringer through that. But it was just, we're living in a world where like aesthetics matter, and it affected my mental health. And then additionally, it's sort of, I can't really run. I can do like short sprints, but I'm never going to be a marathon runner. Like if I work out too hard, I get chest pain. If I carry a backpack that's a little bit too heavy, I'll get chest pains. Like sometimes if I'm sitting a certain way, I'll get cramps in my back or in my chest. And so there's always these things that are like just a little not normal, but like also um I'm normal passing, like I look, for pretty mainstream, and so I was very self-conscious of that. It affected how I dated. It's always like, oh, but there's this big secret I have to tell a boy. Like what happens when we get past making out? It was like this big thing that kept building and building. Um, so yeah, it felt like I was living like a little bit of a double life. It's really strange now looking back on it. Like I've had a lot of therapy. I also had a surgery. And so I think now looking back on it, I was like, wow, I that felt really big then, and it doesn't feel like at all a thing now. But it's been a very long journey.
I like that you shared that because as you were speaking, I kind of identified the younger version of myself, identified with the younger version of you. Because I think oftentimes when people have invisible disability that you can't see with the, just from the person standing a bit of a distance to you, I think oftentimes we are dealing with mental health challenges. Trying to navigate identity, trying to navigate self esteem, when you're going through that, like from adolescent to like a young adult stage, where again, body image for any woman is so important and so heightened. um, but kind of talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned how it was challenging for you to date. I can say, as someone who lived with sickle cell disease, I grew up seeing my disease as a stigma, but also not sharing it with people I dated. Because I wanted to at least establish some level of trust that if I told this person something that significantly impacts my life, they wouldn't leave. So, how have you been able to navigate dating, and where are you now as far as a sense of identity and feeling almost there's power in what makes you uniquely different from everyone else?
Yeah, so I think when I began dating, so I think like culturally I was considered a late bloomer because I didn't really start dating till college. Um, but my big concern was, how am I gonna tell somebody, and will they like me still after knowing that like shirtless I don't look like what everyone else looks like shirtless. And like also like boobs are a really big deal, right? And so I was definitely very hesitant about it, very fearful. I think the first time I had sex, and we got past that hurdle, I was like, okay, maybe it's not so bad. And I think even for him, he was kind of like, oh, this is like not a big deal. Like, and I think the fact that he was not a great guy, I would say overall, like as a person. But in that particular scenario, the fact that he like minimized it so much was very helpful for me, because I was like, this is going to end my world. I am not beautiful or lovable or any of these things. And he was just like, this is a non-issue. And I'm like, oh, it can be a non-issue. Like you're still going to be here despite this. So that was kind of the first time like my mindset sort of shifted. Um, Same with my second boyfriend. And I think after that, what I then noticed was like I kind of stopped thinking about what do men think. Um, and I started thinking about like what do I think? And for me, what was very hard is I felt like I love fashion and I couldn't really express myself in a way. Um, I mean, like, I feel like so many more things are acceptable now that they weren't then. And I just truly wanted to not think about it. And so that's when I made the decision to get surgery. So I went to a plastic surgeon. Now, there is a corrective surgery you could do. Me and my parents talked about it when I was 13, 14, and that's where they stick a metal rod in your chest and they rotate it and they literally pop out your ribs. And then you wear that for like a long time. Eventually, I think for some people the rod can come out, for some people it doesn't. And you're in basically a lot of pain, but you're like literally reshaping your bones. My parents were like, absolutely not, we're not doing that. It's so invasive. And I was a long time very mad at them for not wanting me to do that. And then later on, I was like, yeah, actually, I don't think I want something that invasive that changes how you have to learn how to sit up. You have to like learn how to do everything again because you literally have unmovable metal in your chest. Um, but then later on, when I was looking at surgery, I was looking for something more cosmetic. I wanted to wear a bathing suit without thinking about how I looked. I wanted to wear a V-neck shirt without ever thinking about it. And so I found a plastic surgeon and I went to him and I was like, this is a problem. And I would like a boob job. And I actually found this amazing surgeon who listened to me, which is, I got very lucky. And the more that Seoni and I talk to women and talk to doctors, we find out more and more how hard it is to find a doctor that will advocate for you. I got really lucky on my first shot. I found a doctor who was like, I don't think a boob job is what you want. I think you're looking to feel more even and it's not even about the cleavage for you. And I was like, yeah, but like, what else is there? He was like, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to take pictures if that's okay with you. And then do I have your consent to take these pictures to a plastic surgeon convention that I'm going to in a couple weeks? I will consult with the surgeons there and then together we can come up with a solution that will help you. And they did that. And then I had that surgery and it was actually exactly what I needed. Like I think one of the things with surgery that he also said is like, whatever you're envisioning, it probably won't look exactly as how you imagine. It's not going to fix everything, but it will definitely look better than like where you're at right now and it'll get you closer towards your goal. And he said to me, stay with us for at least a year. And if you still feel like you want a boob job, then come back to me. And he was right. Like within like 6 months, I was like, this is great. I am happy. I am fine. I don't need anything else. And it really, yeah, it really changed everything for me because I did it for me. And I, again, had a doctor advocating for me. And so it did make it a lot easier.
Thank you for sharing that, because it just kind of makes me realize how we have different diagnoses here. We have different things here that are represented. And what you just shared makes me feel like, hey, we're in this together. My diagnosis is also, you know, fueling certain insecurities that I have about myself. So yeah, thank you for sharing that process. I do want to kind of pivot a little bit and ask Sione a couple of questions
Yeah.
about, yeah, you have an experience with your grandmother who had Bell's palsy, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Could you share your experience as a caregiver to your grandmother?
Yeah, sure. So, for a bit of context, when my grandma was growing up, she had Bell palsy on one side of her face, which basically
Mm-hmm.
means you have a weakness or like a
Mm-hmm.
drooping within one side of your face. And I think just because of the state of healthcare way back then, I don't think it ever fully went back to normal. Usually with Bell palsy, it's something that's temporary. For her, it was not. So, growing up, she was, I think her parents very much push this narrative of like, you're never going to find somebody because you look this particular way. So for them, arranged marriage was a big thing, and that's pretty much how everybody was paired up. There was no finding your own and having this beautiful love story. And somebody came to her parents and said, we would like our son to marry you. And her parents said, absolutely, that's what you're going to do because nobody else is going to want to marry you. She at the time was in India with my granddad, and then they moved over and migrated to the UK. When she came to the UK, there are more healthcare options here compared to what there were in India back then, and she had some corrective surgery to help with that drooping. I've never seen pictures, so I don't know what the extremities of it are, but they told their children, so my dad and his brothers and sisters, that she was electrocuted. So I don't know why that was the case, that they've always gone with that narrative of she was electrocuted. But when my mum, who is her main primary caregiver, goes to doctor's appointments, she has then over the years realised that in her medical records it says Bell's palsy, and that's exactly what she has. She was not electrocuted. So I don't know whether there was some shame around how she looked, and so they came up with an excuse to tell their children. But I've only really noticed the emotional impact it's had on her more so as I've grown up. So growing up, she lived with me up until I was about 16. And then when I was 16, her and my granddad moved out just so they could have a bit more independence for themselves. So they only live about 5 minutes down the road. But I think the The big one when I noticed a difference is during COVID when we couldn't go into her flat to see her. She's a very high risk woman, so we'd keep our distance and things like that. And there was one particular picture we took outside her flat. She was standing in the window and we were outside. And when I took the selfie, obviously on my phone it shows as a reflection. It doesn't show as how you would see it in person. And in that photo, I looked at her face and I was like, this looks strange. And then I flipped it and to see what I would usually see, and then realized that's what she sees in the mirror every day is the flipped version, which looks so much worse than what it does to the rest of the world. Um, there are rarely pictures of her smiling with us. And I think that's when I kind of noticed for me that if you think that's how you look and you're not happy with that, you're probably not going to want to smile for pictures. You're probably not going to want to have your picture taken. So I think mentally, I've seen more and understood more of how it's affected her growing up and how she maybe treats herself in that regard, because I can imagine, you know, growing up being told that nobody's going to love you and also never really seeing anything different in the mirror other than your reflection that potentially looks a lot worse than what the rest of the world sees is something really quite difficult to live with. And I think as you get older, you have a little bit more sympathy and empathy for your parents and your grandparents. And that is something that over more recent years has definitely become a little bit more transparent, and you can understand more so why she is the way she is. But for her, I think it's not necessarily something she talks about, but you can tell in moments of taking photos or celebration moments and things like that how it potentially does affect her. And I think it's a lot to take, you know, growing up, like we've just talked about in terms of like dating and things, not that she had those experiences, but it's still something that massively impacts your confidence and how you move through the world. So I cannot even begin to imagine what that would have been like for her growing up. But yeah, it's not necessarily something she talks about, but you can see the emotional impact it's had over the years for her.
I think it's very interesting. As you were speaking about your grandmother, all I kept thinking was she has been conditioned to think she will never be loved because of her appearance.
Yeah.
And so, even if by a miracle the droopiness was gone, she might still see herself the way she's always seen herself. And for me, I think stigma is often like there's a lot of stigma associated with complex diseases because again, you're kind of othered in a way that you shouldn't be.
Absolutely.
And as a young woman, I can just imagine, because one of the things I love about adulthood is you start to uncover the people that are your loved ones, either your mom, your dad, your grandparents. You start to know the individual outside of the role they play in your life, and that sheds more light into it. It almost makes you very empathetic because you fully realize that even though she is my grandmother, there is a woman behind my grandmother who
Yeah.
had to go through so many just things that will cause anyone anxiety and a
Yeah.
certain level of frustration when the world is telling them you you look like you're unlovable. So but in talking about that, one of the reasons why I loved having both of you on the podcast is there is solidarity in going through healthcare issues. Um, and there's a spectrum of healthcare issues we know in present day. But I think bonding over the fact that in each of our individual journeys, either we are directly impacted or our loved ones are impacted by it. But we're able to kind of come and have conversations that I hope someone listening to this who is dealing with Bell's palsy, or someone listening to this who, for example, Venetia, is going through that adolescent stage where now we live in an age of social media, right? We could hide when we were kids. and what we're going through are necessarily, but now in a world where kids from the moment they get on social media, it's being re-emphasized to them, this is what the standard is, this is what you should look like. I can only imagine that it would be incredibly challenging for both their emotional and mental well-being as well. But Sione, can you talk to us a little bit about support, because I think you are sort of an anchor in this conversation. You have a connection to your cousin, sister, Vanesha. You have a connection to your grandmother. But having loved ones of yours go through complex illnesses, how has that kind of shaped who you are today?
It's a great question. I think the biggest experience that I've had that's probably shifted how I react to these sorts of things is through my mum. So back when I was maybe 16, 17, she had a really extreme eczema flare up. She's had them previously and they're usually stress induced, but this one was really, really bad. She had it all over her arms, her chest, her face, really severe to the point that she looked like a burns victim. People would go out in the street, stare at her. People would open doors for her because I think they were just so in shock by her appearance. People would say hi to her when usually, especially in London, people are not social. People keep to themselves. So she was like, all of a sudden, everybody's talking to me. And it must be because of how I visibly look. My mom is very strong-willed, and I'm very grateful for that. And she was always kind of like, even though this is how I look, I'm still going to go about my day and I'm going to continue to do things, because what good is it to me being locked up um, and and staying here and hiding away from people when there's no reason why I can't get on and do my day-to-day activities, even though I am in pain, even though I do look visibly different. And a lot of people will often have a lot of opinions on how you care for yourself. And I think in some of those moments where family, friends, whoever it was, would have their 2 cents on what she should do about her own skin conditions, there were moments where I had to learn to advocate for my mum when she was not in the room. And I think that's a very beautiful thing to be able to do, to be able to stand up for someone in that way. But also, not every day was as easy as that for her to be able to go out into the world. There were many days where she would be in tears and she would not want to go outside. I remember she had an amazing opportunity to go to the patrons' lunch. It was around one of the Queen's birthdays. She was the patron of my secondary school and she'd won tickets to be able to go. And so she went with some of my teachers. She took one of her sisters, and her focus for that day. My mum loves to stand out in these sorts of situations, especially if there's going to be royalty. Why would you not want to stand out and catch the eye of a royal member of the family? But for her in that day, she wanted to blend in as much as possible because she did not want anybody to see how she looked. And the irony is she ended up on the front page of a newspaper because I guess the cameras must have seen her face, and when Prince Harry went to shake her hand, they must have thought, oh, she looks different, and everyone clearly zoomed in. Not that you can tell in the pictures on the first page, but it's funny to see that she was trying to blend in when the reality is she actually stood out, and she ended up all over the news and in the newspapers, on TV, all kinds of things like that. So it's been really interesting following her through that. And now it's cleared up and it comes out in other ways. It's not reappeared on her face in the same way. But I think for me, it's taught me that being able to advocate for people when you have the opportunity is something really powerful, especially if they're not able to advocate for themselves. But also, as well, it teaches you empathy, because a lot of the times in those situations, a lot of people don't know what to say or don't even know what the right words are. And I think through that, it teaches you some of the small things that you can do and say. My mum has a friend who's she's really, really close with, who got diagnosed with cancer a few years ago. And my mum was just like, she's shaving her head and I don't know what to say. And I was like, well, this is some of the things I learned when you were going through things with your appearance of not knowing what to say. And I think those lessons are things you can kind of pass forward in terms of someone just wants you there to support. And it's not even about what you say, it's just about showing up for that person. So yeah, I think that's some of the main things I've learned in terms of caregiving. It is just more so about showing up than what you do or what you say.
Now, would you say that your experience as a caregiver gave you the passion to be known as the mental health guru of the two of you? Because I've listened to your podcast, and the gap between the two of you that you both identified is, Seonni, you are the mental health expert of the two. So would you say that that experience with your mom and your grandmother made you want to go in that direction?
That's so funny that you say that. I would never think of myself necessarily in that light. I think I have been very lucky in having Venetia as my that to take on that big sister role for me and push things like therapy from a very early age. So at university in my second year, I had a bit of a depressive episode,
Mm.
and the thought of going to speak to someone about my problems gave me my very first anxiety attack. So, but also there's nobody in our family or in many generations that have been able to have access to those kind of resources from such a young age. And so I think my awareness for things like mental health has always been very present. I think just through the company
Mm.
I've kept, I've had really diverse friends, very sort of LGBTQ positive and things like that. So my mind has always been very open to a lot of things, and it's something I've taken through with me. Through university, I was always involved with sort of the welfare and diversity sections of the students union and things like that. But I think these experiences have pushed the direction in which I have taken therapy. Oftentimes, I've had several courses and felt like I've not really gotten to the bottom of what my problems are. And I've been very, very privileged in the fact that I've been able to figure out what it is I need and be able to seek out the right types of therapists to get that help. And it's funny because my therapist that I have now, she always says, I distinctively remember our very first conversation because you brought to the table exactly what you wanted. And I've never had anybody say, I want to do this work, this work, this work, and this work. They just kind of come with a problem and say, can you help me with it? Whereas I was like, I want to do inner child work, I want to do this, I want to do this. And it just sticks out so much in her mind that I knew exactly what I wanted to work on and fix and how to do it. And I was just looking for somebody to be the right resource. So I think I'm very aware that with the company I keep, a lot of us are very self aware.
Mhm.
And whilst that has many great privileges, it can be frustrating sometimes seeing other people having to take that journey in a lot slower pace when it's so obvious to you, but not necessarily as obvious to others. So I'm still learning patience with helping my mum, for example, work through her own emotions. But I think having people to push me in the right direction and then be able to take that journey has meant that my awareness of my emotions and my feelings are much greater than I ever thought they would be at this age.
That's amazing.
I always tell Sione she has a 10-year head start on things than I do. And it's true because I didn't get access to therapy until
Mhm.
much later, right?
Mhm.
And then even it took some pushing to get me there. And so even though I think like you and I started seeing a therapist around the same time, I think maybe with
Mm,
like a 9 month to a year difference.
yeah.
She's 12 years younger than me. So
Mhm.
there's like many things that I experienced by myself without that kind of support and unpacking that I've been sort of building, and now I'm getting to unpack those things, and she's getting it, and she's getting a really strong foundation so much earlier. But then I see like as we talk about things, sometimes she's like, "Oh, my parents are doing this because," and I'm at this age, and I'm like, "Yeah, we went through that same phase, but you've got so much you because your mental health foundation is so much stronger. You guys are going to get through it a lot easier."
Facts. You're lucky.
Very.
You are very lucky because it's interesting how now in my 30s, the significant benefits of having a therapist have shown me that it's just like the way you take your car to get an oil change. I feel like that's how important mental health should be for everyone. The minute you are old enough to deal with copious amounts of stress,
Mm-hmm.
i.e., from age 16 and above. Um, So I really, really hope that, again, it continues to be a strong foundation for you. But not only that, but you are in a position to also teach, because I think we have to recognize not everyone has access to mental health services.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, with the knowledge I've gained and the tools I've had, there are people close to me who don't necessarily believe in therapy, but I've been able to share a thing or two about that I've learned that helps to
Yeah.
shift that perspective just even a little bit. All right, so now let's segue. When you had us on your show, one of the reasons Dima and I were excited was it gave us an opportunity to not only showcase the podcast, but also talk about our unique stories with sickle cell disease and how we've navigated this. Now, as both of you might be aware, how did you what was your awareness of sickle cell disease, and how is sickle cell disease seen in the South Asian community? Because oftentimes, as patient advocates within this space, Dima has 10 years, I maybe have 3 to 4. We don't always see brown people. We see Latinas every now and again, but we haven't really seen South Asians put a face on sickle cell disease and kind of help to increase awareness as we do people of African descent or African American descent. And so, can you talk to us a little bit about, one, when were you aware that this blood disease existed in your community, and how is it received? Like, are there conversations within the family unit where this is talked about?
I'm happy to go first, if you want. So I will say, like, so my personal knowledge of sickle cell, I would say it's come from TV and like watching Call the Midwife and things like that. Um, but I think as far as the brown community goes, I would say that I've been uh, mostly unaware, actually, of the prevalence in the South Asian community. I think it probably wasn't until you guys reached out that I started looking into it. I also posed the question to my father, and my father's an engineer. He's super knowledgeable. Um, he's very well read. He's read, like all the main, the main books for the big eight religions and like all these things. Like he's very um, knowledgeable. And even for him, he was like, "Oh, that's not something that really affects us, does it? Or is it only in like one part of India?" So I think it was really surprising for me that he didn't know anything because he knows more than anything, about anything than anyone I know. So I think for my dad to also not know was really surprising. Um, and then I would say that it then is not what is not surprising to me is that it's for South Asians to not know something. When we talk about like my health diagnosis with pectus, they told me it's an anomaly that happens, and I later found through Google, and things that it's a genetic condition, and then also me and my brother now have it, so like clearly it runs in families. For me and my brother to have the same deformity, that's a genetic condition. That means one of our grandparents or great grandparents would have had it. I also have alopecia, and I didn't find out until 2015 when our grandmother was in hospital, and I was talking to our grandmother's brother that he had alopecia and he had a huge flare up in his 20s. There are
I had
lots of
no
things that
idea.
run through. Yeah, when he was 24, he lost all of his hair, all of his eyelashes, eyebrows, everything for 2 to 3 years. Yeah. And so there's stuff like that, right? Like I thought Sione knew because we were visiting, but I don't think we were in the same part of the hospital that day. We were in the hospital together that day, but I don't think we were in the same conversation. So it's stuff like that. And I think it's very prevalent in the South Asian community to not talk about health problems. I think that's why I value the bond I have with Sione so much because the only way we know what's happening as a family in the family is like when we talk to each other. Um, so I can just exponentially expand that throughout the community. I think it's not a surprise to me that Indian people don't know or the people that I've talked to so far, and um, yeah, it's kind of a shock.
Yeah, I definitely
Sione.
second that. I didn't have a huge awareness of it. I felt like I'd heard of it. I kind of had an idea it was something to do with your blood, but I really didn't know the details until you guys came on to our podcast and really shared your experiences. And then after we recorded that episode, actually, I went and spoke to my mum, and I was like, I just spoke to these two really incredible women, but also posed the same question to her and was like, what do you know about it? And I was like, so surprised by her reaction, because she knew even less than I did, which I thought was amusing, but also she had no idea as well of the extent that it impacted our communities as well. So just like Venetia said, the fact that in Indian culture, people don't like to air out their problems, people don't like to share the things that are going on. It doesn't surprise me that people are unaware. But given that Venetia's dad has grown up outside of the UK, and many of our mum's siblings have also grown up outside of the UK. It's surprising to me that it's not something that's at least more commonly known just as a disease in general, regardless of how much it affects our community. I would have thought that potentially it would maybe have come up more through communities of, you know, people that they've met and things like that, that maybe just an awareness of the disease as a whole would be a bit greater.
I just want to add one more thing to that. Is when I turned 30 and I went for my annual exam, my doctor, again, a randomly found doctor who happened to advocate for me, she said, I'm going to do some extra blood panels because you're 30 and because you're South Asian. She's like, South Asian women past, or South Asians generally past 30, tend to be pre-diabetic just because of the general like disposition. And it actually goes back to like generational trauma, colonialism, and like famine. But anyways, that's kind of what we're predisposed to diabetes. And so it came back, and some things are like borderline, and things continue to be borderline no matter how great I eat or exercise. And it came up with my friends last year, and we were talking about it. We're all borderline diabetic. We're all trying to get healthier and all these things, but also our our blood is not on our side in that sort of sense. We are predisposed for this, and we all have to be extra careful now that we're at a certain age with our health if we don't want to be diabetic. And I think it's important, like that, like we're all in our friend group talking about it as a how do we prevent something happening. I think in like the age group that our parents are in, it's more like when something is fully diagnosed and only if it feels like a great impact, like the food you serve in communal settings, then you would probably mention something like that. But that was also news to me when I turned 30 and I had that annual exam. I was like, oh, am I? You know, and it's the entire South Asian population.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool. I'm sitting here watching you guys actually learn about your own family history. You didn't see,
Yeah.
you didn't even know
Yeah.
about
That
a family member that
Yeah.
has each other. So it's kind of it's very interesting to see that. I'm glad that we're discussing this on the show, but I wanted to know, um, even though there's like a lot of lack of awareness in South Asia, and I know you guys still have a pulse on the South Asian community, even though
mm,
you're in the UK, Seonni and Venetia, you're in the US.
mhm.
Do you think South Asia has the infrastructure or equipped enough to have an infrastructure for individuals who are diagnosed with something like sickle cell?
I would feel like they are.
Okay.
Uh, but I say that because I have an understanding of the US healthcare system and the fact that it's a paid system, that even if you pay into it, you may not benefit from it. It's a very it's a very marginalizing system when it comes to
Mhm.
access to healthcare. You know, the NHS in the UK is better. I'll let Sione talk about that, but it's not without faults. uh, in India, and my dad has done this when he goes to India, he'll be like, "Oh, I'm gonna spend a day at the health hospital or whatever," and then like you spend 150 bucks and you can get an MRI, a CT scan, an X-ray. You do full blood panels, everything. He gets like he'll do like a full workup of everything ever that could possibly be tested for what is considered a nominal amount that you would pay as a copay here. So I would say that the access to comprehensive healthcare at cost, is quite different than here, where you could be dying and you still have to beg for it. I feel like in the US, to be super frank, that's like my personal opinion, but I don't think we got great healthcare here. And when you compare to other countries like India and you hear like what you can get, and like people will take vacations to countries that are like this just to get that full workup. And you can get that there. So,
I would agree. Even in the UK, with the NHS, obviously our healthcare is free. It definitely comes with flaws. Trying to just get a GP appointment is absolutely ridiculous. You have to call up at 8 a.m. and you sit in a queue, and half the time you get half an hour into that queue, you finally get to the front of the queue, and there isn't even an appointment for you, and they'll offer you something 2 months down the line. So just getting your foot in and being heard is a real struggle, and we've seen it countless times with guests who have come on and shared their different health experiences with the NHS. I think in India, healthcare is also viewed in a very different way, especially when it comes to mental and physical health, compared to what it is over in the States and what it is here. In the more westernized countries, it's never looking at preventative care. It's always, you have a problem, now let's solve for it. Whereas when you go to countries like India and you have a lot of well-being retreats and Ayurvedic treatments and things like that, healthcare is seen so differently that the transformation you can get from it is vastly different. We have a family friend who is also Indian, South Indian, and for the entire time we've known her, she's had a very dark complexion, and she was always complaining about some of the discolorations and things she was having. And she went to visit some family out in India, and she saw a doctor. She took a really short dose of treatment for something, and she came back and her complexion looked completely different. She looked like a totally different woman. And we're just like, what did you take? Because your face is completely transformed. You glow from within, and all of your skin problems have magically vanished. And we thought, maybe it won't last for very long because you're no longer taking this treatment. And like several years later, her skin has never looked more flawless. And that's such a small thing that my mum is like, maybe I need to go out there and go get my eczema seen too, because if they can do that for such a little bit of discoloration and some sort of skin tags and things like that, think of what they can also do for all the other problems out there, just because their view on healthcare is very differently positioned to what it is out here in the Western countries.
Wow.
I think, yeah, Dima, when you asked that question, I was going to say, yeah, India is actually one of the top countries that a lot of Nigerians who can afford to get like hip replacement surgeries or open heart surgeries in Nigeria. India is the first place everybody goes.
Oh,
So their
interesting.
healthcare, yeah, so their healthcare infrastructure is pretty top notch. I'd say more warriors that I know personally go to India for surgeries as opposed to like South Africa, because in South Africa they don't have a high sickle cell population, as opposed to India where every 100 in 100,000 people have sickle cell disease, and they're a bit more familiar with it as a blood disease. But
wow.
that kind of, yeah. That kind of brings me to my next question. Again, sickle cell within the South Asian community, to my knowledge, and again, I'd like to think I have a global perspective on things. I've been treated on 4 different continents. I have a very eclectic group of friends. But even among my friends of Indian descent, I don't think in the family unit or in the bloodline, there are conversations around whether you have sickle cell trait or you have full blown disease. So I wanted to ask the both of you, from conversations that you have had with your peers, whether that be in the UK or the US, do you get a sense that people from the South Asian community are, there's an overall awareness of sickle cell disease, or would you say for the most part, because your family isn't directly impacted by it, there wasn't ever a need to have, dining table conversations about how sickle cell disease kind of manifests?
Do you want to go first?
Sione, do you want to take that?
Oh yeah, I can.
Or yeah.
I'd say for me and my friends, I feel like there is such a lack of awareness. And it may just be because it's not something that has necessarily impacted our family directly. But even when I look at the community as a whole and the friends that I've had and the conversations that I've had with those people, it's never something that has really come up, which is quite surprising given the sheer number of people that it does impact. And so you would think that people would have at least a greater awareness of whether they carry a trait or something like that. But generally, I think the awareness, at least from the immigrant side of things, is potentially not there. And this is me coming as a third generation immigrant. So I'm even more so removed from those that would be aware. But I think within the UK, it's not necessarily something that is discussed within the brown communities or there is active awareness about. I almost didn't really realize that it predominantly affected people of color until we spoke as well. I think I in my head, up until we spoke, it was just a disease that kind of impacts people proportionally, and I never had the awareness of sort of where it originates from and how it stems. But I don't know if your experience has been similar or different, Benicia.
I would say it's about the same. I think there's a general lack of awareness. And I think even as you were speaking, Sione, I was thinking about like, what would it take for people to know that it affects the South Asian community? Because I feel like I'm fairly plugged in, especially on like social and what's happening. And I feel like we don't see people talk about it. Like it's not discussed in the friend circle, but I feel like on social media where I'm not seeing like a powerful South Asian, sickle cell warrior, giving speeches about um, their their difficulties. So then I also wonder if it goes back to like, is it something that's shamed or hidden, or if there's something else at play here. I was also just sort of thinking about like, I mean, depending on what part of India and what your family is like, and also just thinking about like how things have evolved there a lot. And also here, we were talking about like marriage and like good partners and things. I think there is a general amount of not pressure, but there is an expectation of like when you're selecting a partner, health is a consideration.
Yeah.
That is definitely something that's like built into, and I think maybe you could probably talk about it, Sione, but like that is and you already have with your grandmother, but like there's a consideration of like, is the partner healthy? Is your partner's family healthy? And I'm wondering if that sort of then creates some sort of seclusion around it. But yeah, it's not very much talked about.
I would agree, especially with things like the caste system and when arranged marriages was so prevalent. It was not just, is this individual the right match for my son or my daughter? It's the
Or like it's
family
not just
unit.
well, yeah,
It's the whole family unit. Do they have health conditions that could potentially affect future generations? And so I reckon there probably was a lot of purposeful exclusion in terms of how people were paired up when it came to marriage that has potentially marginalized the voice for people that do have sickle cell. Um, and it'd be curious just to see in terms of stats from things like the caste system, how that affects sickle cell warriors. Do the lower caste potentially have a higher rate of sickle cell? And is that something that has kind of played through purposefully in matchmaking and how people have continued their generations and things like that? So I reckon it probably does have quite an
yeah,
impact with the awareness that currently exists within the community.
yeah, or even like geographic pooling and like.
Yeah.
I've obviously like since we've met you guys, I've like looked things up, and there are Gujaratis who have sickle cell. We're Gujarati Indian, and so I wonder if there's like parts of Gujarat that have sort of more cases than other. But yeah, it's all gets there's a lot of theories I think that we're now like connecting on
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
on the why is it so not talked about.
I do think it's a caste system conversation. I think it it affects more vulnerable, marginalized groups. And so I think that's the reason why it's probably not in mainstream media or in conversations. You know what I mean? Like, say, for example, if you're on a bus or a train, you don't see an ad for sickle cell disease, because if it's only affecting like the northern part of India, then I would imagine that the majority of people, since they aren't impacted by that, is only when you go to those types of communities or those specific areas that you'll see maybe a little bit more awareness in the community. But I think overall, because I remember very earlier on in my like advocacy journey, like I want to say 5 years ago, I was really shocked when I found out that like India has the second highest population of sickle cell patients after sub-Saharan Africa. And for me, again, it was a point of contention, because I said, if there are that many people affected by sickle cell disease, then in documentaries and shows that depict the sickle cell narrative, there would be more people highlighted. So I think there, and again, we have to also look at the cultural nuances. When you grew up in a certain culture, there are certain like belief systems that exist that help us to kind of maintain equilibrium in our communities. And I think more than likely, maybe there is some kind of stigmatization or shame attached to having the disease. And maybe that's why it's not common practice to have conversations about sickle cell within family units. It's just my process. Thoughts, Dima?
You always have an amazing thought process. You always bringing something to the table with me, and I'm actually thinking about getting medical care myself in in India now, because I was on a personal level. I was looking for just a retreat to go away, to like to have some time, and for a month, like a retreat was like $30,000 here in the U.S.
Oh wow.
That's
And so,
I mean,
and
I have friends here who will go, and like my parents, like friends, like they're in their family, they'll just go. And so it's definitely, I recommend it. I don't know anyone who's come back and been like, that wasn't worth it. Like everyone comes back like more peaceful, more calm, and even like from a wellness perspective. So I'm an advocate for
okay, so we'll talk after this.
Yeah.
So moving forward, I want to talk about a future, going in a like a more future direction. We talked about the infrastructure in India. We talked about the lack of knowledge of sickle cell disease, although it's like the second highest populated um, area for sickle cell warriors. What other steps do you think we need to take to actually ignite awareness when it comes to sickle cell disease and other disease areas within the South Asian community?
I think there needs to be, I think on a personal level, awareness comes from education, but I think people don't necessarily find education, aren't motivated to get educated until they see something that hits something more mainstream. I think the thing I think about a lot is like uh, before Winnie Harlow became a model, people saw vitiligo as a problem. And vitiligo is also very prevalent in the South Asian community as well as the Black community. Um, and I think, I've been to, weddings and Indian events, and I'd be like, Mom, Dad, like, why does their, like, are they okay? And my mom, I was like, oh yeah, like they lose pigment in their skin. It's a skin condition. Like my parents could explain it to me, but it's like you're not going to ask questions if you don't see it. And then Winnie Harlow became a model, and then suddenly everyone's talking about vitiligo, and you get this acceptance, and people want to know more. And then like I see there's a dance teacher in New York who's South Asian, and on top of talking about dance in her classes and her dance journey, she's also talking about her vitiligo journey. And so I think we need more spokespeople and like partnerships, and we need like a Nike campaign about like overcoming, like finding wellness in invisible, and we need like a Black woman and a Hispanic woman and a South Asian woman, like something that presents on the forefront of the stage. Because I think people are generally overwhelmed, but I think there's a really big conversation about healthcare happening right now where people are looking for answers. And I think we need role models and we need awareness and we need voice. Um,
I also think
What are your thoughts, Yoni?
I also think that none of us really know enough about our own health, and it's only when a problem presents that we go looking for those answers, especially with the way that healthcare is here. There is a whole generation of women my age that me and my friends often talk about this. Even with things like a lot of the problems you have during puberty with periods, with acne and things, all of my friends and I were just given the contraceptive pill, and that doesn't solve for anything. That only hides and puts like a plaster over the problems that you have that you then have to go and undo 10 years later when you finally have the knowledge that something is potentially wrong and that when you come off birth control all of these issues are going to present again. So in that sense, I almost feel like without the lack of knowledge of your genotype and things like that, it's eventually going to come up in ways that you don't even realize because you could all be carriers and have no idea because it's never impacted you until something comes up where potentially you have a child that has sickle cell. So I think it is very much to do with having people out there sharing their stories, but also there is a piece of people just don't know enough about their own bodies, even trying to get. I remember when I was visiting Venetia once and she'd just had blood tests done and she could see the results coming through on her phone and the amount of detail that she got was incredible versus here I can't even get a copy of my blood results to see like where the readings even lie. I just get told that this one thing is low and I don't even get told how much by or where it's supposed to sit in that range. So getting information on your own body seems to be really challenging despite it being your own body and you should have access to that kind of information.
I agree 1,000%. I think even as you were both speaking, what I kept saying is maybe the conversation needs to start with anemia before it even delves into sickle cell anemia, because many people, just by getting a blood test, oftentimes when I meet people of color and they're like, when most people are relatively fine, they're cold. I'm like, it could be possible that you are anemic. That's a consideration, and so maybe that needs to be the approach into having larger conversations like this. As you both were speaking, I was trying to search for famous celebrities who have sickle cell disease, and everyone that came up where in the science space, like chemical engineering, these are people who are like well established, but are then leveraging their intelligence and also their status to talk about sickle cell disease. But I then said it might be also a conversation where if we humanize how we talk about these diseases, because when you really think about culture and how culture works within like a social community, um, we do what we're told, and for generations we've been doing that. But I think things need to change, especially in a day and age that we live in now where rare diseases and autoimmune diseases are becoming more prevalent. I think there's been changes in our food, how things are grown, and so things are morphing in the human system way differently that they were in the past. And so I just think we all have to be kind of educate ourselves about things that involve our health, because once you don't have your health, you have nothing. And so I think that that's kind of one strategy at the top of my mind that I was like, oh, this might be a way to kind of navigate that conversation better. But Benicia Sioni, this was such a great conversation. I'm happy we did this because it gives us an opportunity to really fully understand your whys. And for me as an individual, I'm drawn to people when I better understand what makes them thrive and what makes them in you know especially great in the space that they take in. And Venetia, thank you for, I remember the first time when we connected about the collaboration and you really were so transparent with us and trusted us with that. And so I just wanted to say, incredibly grateful that you deemed our podcast worthy of sharing your deeply personal story. And so I hope that when we finally premiere this episode, that someone somewhere who is dealing with that can look to you as a source of inspiration to keep going, because you have conquered and you have been able to grab life by the horns, and also your health, I think, because even though you said, yes, I was lucky to find a doctor who took my case to a conference, there's still that proactive method where you didn't take no for an answer and you genuinely wanted to find a better solution for
Yeah.
what you were born with.
Yeah. I thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I also just want to add that, like, for anyone who's listening, and I feel like you guys probably tell your listeners this too, but when it comes to doctor advocacy, like advocating for yourself, I think people get really scared of getting other opinions.
Yeah.
Like when Sioni was getting on birth control, I used to be like, and I was like, are they telling you what all your options are? And like, if this one isn't fitting right, make sure you go back to the doctor. But also I had needed an endocrinologist, and I went to one doctor and all my blood panels were looking crazy. And he was like, yeah, but you're fine. And I was like, well, can you just explain what this panel means to me? And he was like, yeah, but you're fine. I could, but like, you're fine. Do you need to do another? I can give you a more extreme, like a more thorough test if you want. I was like, I just need an explanation. He was so dismissive, and I was like, I'm never seeing him again. And I saw this other doctor, and she literally just walked me through my panel. I was like, I don't even need to do the blood test again. Can you explain what all these hormones in the ranges, what it means? And she walked me, and I love her. Now she's in a different hospital system. I'm like, yep, I'll go to whatever hospital system you're in. And so I just think, as people go on their healthcare journey, whatever it looks like, it's really important to feel listened to. And I think that also ties back to the podcast that Sioni and I have, because we feel there's power in story, and the individual experience is really important, and you should advocate for your own as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And Vanesha says, you don't know what you don't know. And I feel like our podcast is trying our very best to inform people so that they can know as much as there possibly is to know about all elements of life, so they can go and advocate for themselves, whether it's in your family unit, in your relationships, in your healthcare, whatever it is. The more you speak about things, then that's the only way you're going to know about certain problems. I had a friend recently go through a health scare, and I instantly, through just talking to people, was like, it could be endometriosis, it could be PCOS, it could be this, it could be this. And I helped her figure all that out. And she's like, how do you know all these things? And I think it's purely through being able to talk to people and understanding and wanting to learn about those things. So there's so much power in gathering knowledge, even if you don't feel like it affects you, because it comes in handy and it helps you advocate for not only yourself, but your peers, your family members as well.
Well, thank you, ladies, so much for joining us. And I want to implore our Through the Genes audience to check you guys out. Please check out the Mind the Gap podcast. It's like 35 episodes, right? That's happening, right? That's
35 episodes.
These episodes are amazing. I'm still combing through them. I've learned so much. There's amazing authors on there. When I'm telling you guys, I'm fanning out over this podcast. It's the absolute truth. And I've been writing things down and taking knowledge for myself. It's been very helpful. So Sioni, Vanesha, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honor for you to be on Through the Genes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for educating us. Yeah, like I appreciate you wanting to have us on to educate us as well, as we're trying to fill in these like knowledge gaps. So yeah, very appreciative of how reciprocal all of this has been.
Yeah, definitely second that. We've both learned so much. So we're so thankful that you reached out and you were willing to do this collaboration.
Don't forget to follow Sickle Cell Prodigy and Through the Pain Inc. for additional resources and initiative updates. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Through the Genes.